Right now it's 4 degrees. It's 5 over in Wlea, and I know that because we have Dr. Gary Ostrower on the line.
Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Dr. Ostrower says it's 5 over in Wlea, and a little warmer there than it is here, Dr. Ostrower.
Well, yes. I mean, it's balmy here in Wlea, and it's 5 in contrast to 3 degrees in Alfred and 4 degrees in Hornell. So I'm staying here for today.
Hey, before we get to those the topics we were going to discuss, Michael Cohen, the 81 letters of investigation, North Korea, I did want to ask you the Confucius Institutes. Now, before we went on the air, you mentioned that there's one at Alfred University too.
That's correct.
And yes, that's they don't say what's going on. I don't think it's an official investigation, just something that the FBI is keeping an eye on. I thought that was a little unusual.
Well, it is unusual, but it's not completely new. I don't remember exactly. I mean, I think that the Confucius Institute at Alfred University, remember, which is funded by the Chinese government, the Confucius Institute tends to do things like send students who are learning Chinese out to public schools in order to teach the Chinese language, which is probably a pretty good idea. They occasionally sponsor talks, particularly to Chinese students who may be visiting the United States. A number of years ago, I was asked to do something like that to give them a kind of general history of the United States with an emphasis on technical innovation, something that I didn't know a huge amount about. But I do also recall, and again, the details are hazy, so don't hold me to exactly this, but that there was about 2 or 3 years ago, there were some serious questions raised about Confucius Institutes, at least at some universities, regarding the subject of intellectual property theft and so forth. In other words, that members of the Confucius Institute may have been, particularly in the STEM areas and the technical areas, seeking information from research that was being done at these universities. Now, I don't know whether that is that the allegation was correct. I don't know whether there was any real evidence to suggest that the Confucius Institute was involved in that. I have certainly not known anything about that kind of thing at Alfred University. My guess is that it has not happened, but I'm not sure. And we're going to have to wait. But the idea that the FBI is involved in this kind of investigation, that I find to be kind of interesting. And, we're just going to have to wait and see whether anything materializes.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Moving on now to the main topics. Michael Cohen, now New York Post's page 6 said that Michael Cohen was living it up before he had to start serving time.
Well, he may very well have been. I'm sure that he was very, very well paid as the president's, before he was the president, as his fixer. And he actually, even during his presidency, I think that most of us are now aware that Cohen was the guy who handled the hush money payoffs to Stormy Daniels. But he did a lot more than that, and he had even admitted to, threatening up to 400 to 500 people on the president's behalf, or on Donald Trump's behalf, over the previous years. Again, many of these so-called threats before Trump ever became president. But from my perspective, the Cohen thing is going to remain controversial. The Republicans on the House, during the hearings last week, essentially said one thing: "You are a liar." As one of them put it, "You are a lying liar." And of course, Cohen had, in fact, lied to a congressional committee somewhat earlier. So, he's going to have to deal with that part of his past. On the other hand, his testimony was pretty credible. And in some areas, I think that there's plenty of evidence to back things up. He brought in with him, he brought to the committee checks that were paid to him by President Trump regarding the Stormy Daniels payoff, in others to reimburse Cohen for what he had given, the $130,000 that he had paid to Stormy Daniels. But, forget Stormy Daniels. I think that, a lot of what the president did according to Michael Cohen, skirts the area of illegality and certainly obstruction of justice. And that's going to be the real problem that the president is going to have. So after the hoopla kind of settles down, we may find, again, historians are going to look at this some years later, but I wouldn't be shocked if historians say 5-10 years from now that Cohen's testimony was a real turning point in providing very, very credible evidence against the president in respect to felonies that he may have committed.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, a lot of talk this morning about a New Yorker magazine article about by a Jane Mayer. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Ostrower?
Jane Mayer has been writing for The New Yorker, and The New Yorker is a top-notch magazine. The quality of their investigative reporting is excellent. She has worked for them for about 25 years. If I'm not mistaken, she started working for The New Yorker, started writing for them back in 1993. She's a political reporter. She wrote a book, an excellent book, one of the two best books I think that I have read on the subject of politics generally in the last 10 years. It's called Dark Money. Dark Money, and if I think, I would certainly recommend that people take a look at it just as a sense of getting a sense as to what's going on under the surface of American politics. But she wrote a long article, and it was published, I think, just yesterday, about the relationship between Fox News and the president. And among the things she says in the article is that, the president has a very, very close relationship with Sean Hannity, so much so that they are, in contact almost every single day. She said that that Fox, that Roger Ailes, who had been the president of Fox for years, or the head of Fox for some years, had tipped Trump off, had tipped candidate Donald Trump off in 2015 during the first presidential debate to questions that he was likely to get, including a rather critical question from Megyn Kelly. We may remember the upshot of that question. And likewise, there may have been some other things that he had been tipped off to, that is, the president may have been tipped off to in respect to the debates. He also said that the president had told Gary Cohen, who was the president's economic advisor, to make absolutely sure that the merger between AT&T and Time Warner was killed. And Gary Cohen, the economic advisor, said to the president's chief of staff, General Kelly, that under no circumstances will he do this. He said it in a much more colorful language that I can't use on this program right now. But what Cohen was saying is that we have no business whatsoever interfering in that kind of a relationship between, in this case, AT&T and Time Warner. And the reason why, according to Jane Mayer, that the president wanted to kill the deal is because Time Warner owned CNN, and CNN had been critical of some of the president's policies. This is after Trump had already become president. So it's a long article. There's a lot of very, very interesting stuff in there. Some of it is clearly uncorroborated, even though it comes from 2 or 3 different sources and whatnot. And my guess, Brian, is that in the next week or so, we're going to hear plenty about this. What it also indicates is that, and this is, I think, troubling, is that we have a news organization in the United States that has essentially become a kind of a state news organization rather than an independent, genuinely critical news organization. And I think that we should all be somewhat, concerned about that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've seen the accusations out of the Jane Mayer article in the New Yorker. I was a little skeptical of the idea of Rupert Murdoch being a big Trump fan. Now, maybe that's true. I don't know. It just seems that most people on the channel, except for Hannity and Tucker, seems that most people on the Fox News channel tend to veer more towards the Shepard Smith viewpoint. And I know a lot of people who don't watch Fox regularly might not think that, but I think there's a lot of truth to what I just said there, Gary.
Well, I think that Chris Wallace is a first-rate reporter. and I should.
Yeah, I think more people at Fox are more along the lines of maybe a Chris Wallace than a Shepard Smith. Yeah,
But it has been said by others, and I think it's confirmed by Jane Mayer in this article, that Fox and Friends is absolutely down the line with the president, and that the president look, he watches, we believe, somewhere between maybe 2 hours and 4 hours or even 5 hours of Fox every single day. And that's also troubling because it means he's not doing the work of state. And he has also taken information that has come from Fox, and then he has tweeted this stuff, he has broadcast this stuff, he has even made it into public policy, not the least of which was his rejection of a deal between the Democrats and the Republicans for some funding for the wall that he wants to build, between the United States and Mexico. And when some of the Fox News personalities criticized him for, apparently being willing to accept this kind of a deal, he then rejected it, even at the cost of shutting down the government. And he shut down the government for reasons that, I think most of us would admit right now were unnecessary. I mean, he said himself that, this was unnecessary, and he said that the emergency declaration could have been, done later and so forth. I mean, there's an awful lot going on that does not bring him a lot of credit, and I think that the article is going to, the New Yorker article, which, as I say, appears in the March 11th issue, is not going to help his reputation along these lines.
Dr. Ostrower, I want to throw an idea out there that I have that I wondered what your take on it is. The ratings show that Fox only, the TV ratings show that Fox, sometimes they do well, sometimes they're beat by MSNBC, but they have Fox is only having 1, 2, 3 million viewers. I don't buy that. I think it's a lot more than that. I don't know why. I don't understand too much about the ins and outs of TV ratings and how they work, but I bet you it's a lot more than 1, 2, 3 million people that see this, that, or the other show, or this, that, or the other newscast.
Well, I can't offer a lot of information about that. The Jane Mayer article notes that Fox has a daily viewership of around 3 million people. And the one thing she does confirm is that that's a lot more than CNN. It's a lot more than MSNBC. It's a lot more than any other cable competitor. Whether it really is more than 3 million, I'm in no position to say. But I want to make a historical comment, and this is not about Fox. It's not about CNN, but it has something to do with information. I teach a course right now on the history of American slavery, and I've assigned to my students in that course a book that all of us have heard about, but very few of us have actually read, and that's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was this dynamite novel back in the 19th century that was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I want to remind you that there were only about 27 or 28 million people in the United States, many of those not literate, many of those too young to really appreciate the book, and certainly not able to read the book. So of that very limited population, we're told that in the very, very first year that it was published, approximately 300,000 copies were sold. That's a lot. That's 1% of the population. And by over the next 7 years, and others until the Civil War itself, about 2 to 3 million copies were sold. Now, again, that's a lot. But is it really 2 or 3 million? And the reality is that at least during the 19th century, it was probably more than that, in the sense that many people during the 19th century read to others out loud. So, you didn't have cable news. You didn't have NBC, or you didn't have the NBA or the National Football League or the Major League Baseball to compete. Movies had not yet been invented, and so forth. And so a father or a mother might read to the entire family. So it wasn't just that 300,000 people had read that book during the first year. It was that the word of that book, the information in that book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, would probably have reached something like maybe 1.5 million people, and then over the course of the additional years, even more than that. In other words, people read out loud. Now, with television, you're not reading out loud. Have in fact more people than 3 million watch the program? I don't know. I mean, perhaps entire families are watching it, And so maybe it's in 3 million households, and if each family has perhaps 4 people, maybe it's 12 million people that are listening to it. I just don't know the answer to that.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Ostrower in just a moment. Stay with us.
Whether you use your vehicle for personal or business or both, you want to make a good impression when you pull in somewhere. That's why Rohan and Sean at RBS Auto Detailing on the corner of Pine and Canastillo Streets in Hornell are the men to see to get your vehicle looking so nice. RBS Auto Detailing. They're the professionals that have the right equipment to get the job done right. RBS Auto Detailing will get your vehicle cleaned inside and out. RBS Auto Detailing on the corner of Pine and Canastillo Streets in Hornell.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. It's cold out there this morning, Rob.
It is, Brian, and that's going to happen a couple more days in a row. We've got an unusually strong cold air mass which has decided to invade the country from western Canada. It stretches from Montana into Texas through the Carolinas and up into the Northeast this morning, and it's going to be responsible for some rather chilly air. This morning starting out kind of partly cloudy across parts of central and western New York. There's a bit more cloud cover off to our south and east, and we think some cloudiness is going to have tendency to come off the lakes later today, so we're going to be turning mostly cloudy. And later today we'll run the risk of a couple of flurries of snow showers. Not a lot going on locally this morning, but that will change later today. It remains cold throughout today, a high of only 20 to 25. Sunrise was at 6:38 this morning. It'll be at sunset at 6:05 tonight. Don't forget this weekend, we put the clocks ahead 1 hour as we go back to daylight savings time. Tonight we'll have clouds. We may see a few flurries or snow showers. Lows overnight 5 to 10 above. For tomorrow, clouds, some breaks of sun, breezy with the chance of flurries or snow showers, remaining cold, a high of 20. Light snow develops tomorrow night. We could pick up to an inch. Lows will be 5 to 10 above. We'll see light snow tapering off to snow showers Thursday. It's 20 to 25. Another round of precipitation may move through the area Friday. We'll be keeping an eye on that. It's uncertain whether or not it comes this far north or stays to our south down over Pennsylvania, Brian.
And we're back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. I got about 5 minutes left. Dr. Ostrower, when I go to the History Channel's website, do you mind if we get on to this day in history now, Gary?
Oh, I don't mind, but Brian, I would like to say one thing. It's just kind of an announcement, if I may. And that is that on March 18th, that's a Monday, on March 18th at 7:30 in the evening in the campus center at Alfred University, the university is sponsoring a speaker by the name of Aram Goudzosian. He comes from the University of Memphis. He is an absolutely top-notch historian, and he's going to be speaking on the subject of the rise of the Black Power movement. He's focusing on Mississippi in 1966. And that is where, the Black Power movement essentially emerged in the United States. So if anyone has an interest generally in the subject of race and the subject of, the civil rights movement, obviously Black Power and so forth, this guy's good. And I think that you'll appreciate the talk. That's going to be 7:30 p.m. on March 18th in Alfred University's campus center. I wanted to say one other thing, if I may, which has nothing to do with politics or anything else, and that is that Alfred University's basketball team, for the first time in over 25 years, since about over 30 years, wound up in the NCAA Division III basketball tournament. And I just want to give these guys a kind of public shout-out because the team did really, really well this year. We have a young coach who I think has been remarkably successful, and it's always nice to see the kind of interest generated on the AU campus. I saw a few games toward the end of the season. I saw more people in the stands at those games than I have seen in 30 years at Alfred University. And again, a shout out to Coach Russ Phillips and to the basketball team generally.
That's great. I hear a lot about Sam Dagan this year. They say that Sam on the AU team has been doing a great job.
Yeah, he's the number 6 man, and he's like John Havlicek. Some of you may remember that name with the with the Boston Celtics years ago. Dagan has been awfully good. I don't know exactly how many points he scored average per game, but I would guess it's in the neighborhood of somewhere between maybe 11 and 13. But those have come at critical moments. He's also a very, very good defensive player. Just a pleasure to watch him.
That's great. Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Now moving on to this day in history. Well, we've got 3 topics that stood out to me from the History Channel's This Day in History page. 1770, the Boston Massacre. 1946, Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. 1953, the death of Joe Stalin. Which one would you like to cover in our last couple of minutes, Gary?
Well, I say all three of them, but since I don't have a lot of time, let's start with the Boston Massacre. There are massacres and massacres. In 1968, for instance, before the Mexico City Olympics, the Mexican government killed about 250 to 300 Mexican students who were essentially protesting the amount of money that the government was spending on Olympic facilities rather than onto educational facilities and social service facilities and so forth in Mexico itself. That's a lot of people. The Boston Massacre, the total was 5 people. One was a slave. His name was Crispus Attucks. The other 4, of course, were not slaves. What's interesting about it is, well, I think there are a lot of interesting things about it. But the men who fired on the colonists, on those 5 people, who killed those 5 people, and by the way, there are a few others who were wounded during the during the massacre. But in either case, they were defended by, of all people, John Adams. John Adams, who of course eventually became one of the leading revolutionaries. It was John Adams who probably had more to do with the decision to go independent in 1776 than any other single person. He became, of course, the second president of the United States, but he was a first-class lawyer, and he believed that every single person deserved a defense. And so he defended the men who fired, and he won his case. That is, again, just one little interesting, element in the whole story of the Boston Massacre. But what I think is also important about the Boston Massacre is that it proved to a lot of colonists that the British were willing to fire on their own cousins, their own cousins right here in the American colonists. And it really helped, even though, of course, it was only in Massachusetts. But it galvanized anti-British feeling throughout, all 13 colonies. And in that sense, 6 years before the Declaration, but it was certainly one of the major issues that prepared the ground for the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? That they were, ethnically, basically the same 2 groups fighting there, Gary.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were exactly the same 2 groups, and, they had the same British accent back in that period.
Sure.
That's going to change a little bit later. But, when you look at the coming of the Revolution, there are a lot of different things. In some ways, it was an economic quarrel. In some ways, it was a constitutional quarrel. In some ways, it was an ideological quarrel. By ideological, I mean, certain ideas that many of the colonists held that the British perhaps held, some years earlier, but they had kind of betrayed some of their own principles. And that, too, things like, a belief in that all men are created equal, a belief that every single man is entitled to the natural right of life and the natural right to liberty and the natural right to pursue happiness, as Jefferson said it. And I think that, had a lot to do with, what became, of course, the decision to break away from Britain in 1776.
Dr. Ostrower, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure, and I'll talk to you next week.